This is Ed Driscoll for PJmedia.com, and we're talking today with Jonah Goldberg, founding editor of National Review Online, the author of 2008's New York Times #1 best-selling Liberal Fascism, and his new book, The Tyranny of Clichés, How Liberals Cheat in the War of Ideas. It's published by Sentinel Books. It's now out at Amazon.com and your local bookseller. And Jonah, thanks for stopping by today.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Jonah, when I first read the galleys of The Tyranny of Clichés back in February, my first thought, and pardon it how pretentious this is going to sound, was that whereas liberal fascism was the equivalent of Emanuel Goldstein's The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism, the alternative history book within the book of George Orwell's 1984, The Tyranny of Clichés was sort of like the Cliff Notes to the Newspeak Dictionary. Does that incredibly pretentious analogy work at all for you?
It works for me. Yeah, sure. It's certainly true that anyone who's read Liberal Fascism will see the sort of radioactive half-life of that project glowing throughout the Tyranny of Clichés. I spent, as I've been saying for years, I spent 6 years like Howard Hughes with Kleenex boxes on my feet, working on Liberal Fascism in my basement, and so a lot of it was a big education for me. I learned a lot of things about the progressives and all of that kind of stuff, and I really got to work out what I think about progressivism and about how society relates to some of these ideas or non-ideas and all of the rest. And in a way, you can think of liberal fascism as an extended 500-page treatment of one of the types of cliches that I deal with in The Tyranny of Clichés. People use the word fascism to mean all sorts of things that have nothing to do with fascism in order to close off arguments rather than to have them.
Jonah, how will skeptics receive the book's subtitle, How Liberals Cheat in the War of Ideas? Don't both sides speak in cliches? And besides,
yes, and I want to be clear about this. Both sides have buzz phrases, both sides have bumper stickers, both sides use sound bites, all of that kind of stuff. The fundamental difference between the left and the right, as I argue in the first few chapters of The Tyranny of Clichés, is that conservatives and libertarians, and I'll concede Marxists and socialists, but how many Marxists and socialists are left out in the wild these days? They're basically all in captivity on college campuses. But libertarians and conservatives, unlike mainstream liberals or progressives, are open and fairly honest about the fact that they have an ideology. We say these are our first principles. We wear Adam Smith ties. We dork out like Dungeons and Dragons geeks about our founding texts. We have arguments about what Ayn Rand would say or what Whittaker Chambers would say or whether or not Edmund Burke would agree with this, that, or the other thing. Liberals, and this is a point that people like E.J. Dionne and Martin Peretz and a lot of liberal intellectuals will concede, liberals don't have the same relationship with their intellectual history, with their ideology. They deny that they have one. And so this is the key distinction, where conservatives may use buzz phrases, they certainly may use cliches, and sometimes they use them badly. I mean, I can't tell you how many conservatives misuse fascism to this day. But at the end of the day, you talk to a conservative and you say, well, look, here are my principles, here's where I'm coming from, and all the rest. Liberals claim that they're pragmatists, that they're empiricists, that they're fact finders, that they only care about what works, and they just wish we crazies on the right would drop all of these labels and these ideological, squabbles so that we could get busy doing the work the American people sent us to Washington to do and all that sort of nonsense. And that is a monumental lie. And it's first and foremost a lie liberals tell to themselves. The idea that liberals aren't ideological is just nonsense on stilts. And I don't mind that liberals are ideological. What I mind is that they won't admit it. It's sort of like liberal media bias. I don't mind that. I don't really care that much that the mainstream media is biased at this point. That's something we learned to live with. What bothers me is, what really just drives me to distraction, is the way mainstream journalists deny that liberal media bias even exists. And so the tyranny of the cliches is that a lot of the cliches I go through in the book, they're not just liberal talking point cliches. They are more fundamental formulations that sort of steal ground for progressive assumptions about the way the world works, man's place in the universe, and all of the rest. It's not just sort of Obama versus Romney kind of talking points. It's a more fundamental thing. You know, Jonathan Ralston Saul has this expression, the unconscious civilization. And it's sort of the civilization that maybe a visitor from Mars would see that we don't really recognize because it's, you know, our dogma makes a lot of assumptions invisible to us. Liberals have an enormous amount of dogma. They're far more dogmatic than conservatives are. And it expresses themselves, and they express their dogmatism and their ideology not in open and honest, declarations of ideological preference, but in these sort of cliched buzz phrases and terms and truisms that they claim aren't ideological at all. I mean, there's nothing a conservative regularly says that is more wildly, radically extremist in its ideological assumptions than, say, violence never solved anything. I mean, that is the most idiotic and wildly, radically ideological, reality-distorting conviction if you actually believe it. And yet they say they believe it, and at the same time they claim that it's not ideological at all.
Well, hence the conservative T-shirts that started making the rounds during the Iraq War that read, "Except for ending slavery, fascism, Nazism, and communism, the war has never solved anything."
Right. I mean, the response has sort of become cliched. And so one of the things I did in the book was I actually went and tried to do a little of the intellectual history on this. And there are a lot of people who believe, including some devout and decent Christians, that we get the violence never solves anything from Jesus. But we really don't. You know, the Catholic Church had a just war theory for, 1,000 years. Jesus told his followers to carry swords. The idea that is fundamental to Christian belief that violence never solves anything is just not true. It doesn't mean that Christians are particularly keen on violence, but they don't believe that it never solves anything. We really owe it to Gandhi. And Gandhi's success, which is a point that George Orwell and Paul Johnson have made in great detail, Gandhi's success owed itself entirely to the fact that he was playing on the guilty consciences of Westerners, of basically the British Empire. He was a creature of the British Empire. Gandhi would not have been able to succeed in anything that he was doing if it wasn't for the fact that he was working within the constraints of a decent liberal empire. And it's telling that, we use this phrase, violence never solves anything, as a means to basically check the use of force by the United States government or by NATO or the West. It's always to stop the good guys from doing anything to the bad guys. And that's how it was born. Gandhi never told Adolf Hitler, he called Adolf Hitler his friend, never told Adolf Hitler, don't invade, Britain. He told the British that they should surrender to Adolf Hitler because violence doesn't solve anything. His solution to the Holocaust was that the Jews should commit mass suicide, which, as a Jew, I find, not all that helpful. And certainly I don't consider it to be a pragmatic position. It's not a pragmatic, non-ideological position. It is a wild-eyed, fanatical position. But because it's said by a dude in a sari, who cared more about bowel movements than sex and all that kind of crazy stuff, people sort of take it at face value that it was the sort of decent, high-minded thing. And so people ask all the time, what would Gandhi do? And frankly, I don't give a rat's ass what Gandhi would do because, I think he did some wonderful things, and I think he was ultimately right about, and he was a decent man in many respects in his personal life, and he was not a hypocrite and all that kind of stuff for the most part. His worldview was nonsense. And in countries that aren't decent, in societies that aren't decent, the Gandhis get swept up the first night and get thrown into a prison cell or are executed. There are no Gandhis in Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union or in North Korea or in Castro's Cuba, not walking about openly flaunting the system because they get arrested and thrown away. It's only in decent societies where we care about these kinds of things where the Gandhis flourish.
Jonah, when we spoke in late 2007 about liberal fascism, I was surprised that it wasn't the laugh-a-minute riot that the early G-files were. And you had mentioned to me that you had retired, as you put it, your Shecky Goldberg phase. Your sense of humor seems to have definitely returned in the Tyranny of Clichés.
Yeah, I mean, I remember talking to you about that back then, and part of it is I really wanted to, you only write your first book once, and I wanted to write a serious book. I had this thing I wanted to get off my chest. I had this argument I wanted to make, and you couldn't do liberal fascism with a lot of jokes, and it's just hard to do the, hey, funny thing about the Holocaust, kind of approach to it, and it had to be a serious book.
It'd make a great Broadway play.
That's true. It was so demonized by the left and all that kind of stuff. If I had started making, pull my finger jokes and parentheses in it, it would have, been disastrous. It had to be a seriously written, serious tone kind of book. And it is true that for a while I was really rejecting the sort of humorist label. First of all, because I don't consider myself a humorist. I consider myself a conservative writer who's not afraid to tell a joke from time to time, and who thinks that sarcasm and mockery is an important form of expression. But I'm not a PJ O'Rourke. And the thing about it's just very hard to be PJ O'Rourke. PJ, maintains a level of comedy in his writing that is just it's very hard to maintain. But at the same time, with liberal fascism out of the way, I thought it was sort of important to get back to the practice of entertaining the reader. And so I tried to make this a funnier book. I also just wanted to write a book that was more fun to write. Liberal fascism was not a fun book to write. It was a lot of work.
Let's discuss some of the liberal cliches debunked in the new book. One of your chapters spends quite a bit of time debunking a newly favorite phrase of President Obama, social Darwinism.
Yeah, this is, and this is a good example of the sort of the spin-offs from liberal fascism. One of the things when you start studying fascism that you have to deal with is this thing called social Darwinism. And you're constantly told in various, textbooks and all the rest that Nazism was a doctrine of social Darwinism. And at the same time, we're told that the robber barons and people like Herbert Spencer were champions of something called social Darwinism in the United States. And there's a huge disconnect here, right? I mean, it sort of gets at that sort of same problem you have where people call libertarians fascists. A libertarian fascist is almost by definition an oxymoron. Hitler was not a real leave him alone kind of guy. And that's part of the distinction here, is that social Darwinism in the European context basically means Hitlerism and racial eugenics and state, and state cruelty and invading countries to impress upon them, Aryan superiority and all that nonsense. But in the United States, social Darwinism, if it means what Herbert Spencer believed in, is wildly radical libertarianism. Herbert Spencer was a soaked-to-the-bone libertarian who opposed imperialism, favored women's suffrage, was a huge champion of private charity, and he is routinely denounced as this social Darwinist who wanted the poor to suffer, and sort of somehow his ideas gave fruit to Nazism, which is just an unbelievable slander. In many ways, Herbert Spencer is the most maligned public intellectual of the 19th century. But here's the bigger problem, is there was no such thing called social Darwinism in the United States. Herbert Spencer never called himself a social Darwinist. William Graham Sumner, his sort of sidekick in the alleged school of social Darwinism, never called himself a social Darwinist. Spencer never even called himself a Darwinist. He had a different theory of evolution. And when you start pressing people about this, they say, "Oh, that's true, or maybe so, or whatever." But Herbert Spencer came up with the term survival of the fittest, which was used to justify so many things, so many evil and terrible things. And, but Darwin is this great and wonderful guy, and he never used that phrase, so survival of the fittest, which is just simply not true. Darwin eventually borrowed the term survival of the fittest and started putting it in all his own work and all of the rest. It's just a complete mishmash of gobbledygook and mythology that the left has created in order to demonize what was basically the American understanding of the role of government, of limited government, free markets, free minds, the individual pursuit of happiness. And the term was essentially invented by defenders or practitioners of reform Darwinism, which was essentially eugenics, which wanted to interfere in the warp and woof of society, which wanted to cull out the unfit and all of the rest. It was It was an invidious way to describe non-socialists. And to this day, Obama and countless liberal politicians and intellectuals invoke social Darwinism as if it is a philosophy that conservatives, first of all, ever held, and that we really want to return to, but they also make it sound as if it ever really existed, which it didn't. It was always a made-up label that the left used to distort and demonize the right.
Jonah, we're out of time for this segment, but we'll be back tomorrow for part 2. This is Ed Driscoll, and you've been listening to part 1 of our interview with Jonah Goldberg about his new book, The Tyranny of Clichés, How Liberals Cheat in the War of Ideas. Tune in tomorrow for part 2, in which Jonah will be discussing the etymology of words like diversity and social justice, and how Bill Clinton used the phrase the middle class as a cliché to ride to victory in 1992. Plus a look back at how Jonah's previous book, Liberal Fascism, was received by the right, the left, and by historians. For PJmedia.com, I'm Ed Driscoll.